Good evening. Welcome, everyone. I am David, a bookseller at Literati Bookstore. We are pleased to welcome Ada Limón to our At Home with Literati series in support of The Herding Kind. She'll be joined in conversation by Dawn Lundy Martin. And just a quick webinar overview for everyone attending. The chat is closed, but you can keep that chat window open as I will be dropping links to purchase the book from Literati throughout the event. The Q&A is accessible, so please, please, please submit questions. They will be answered at the end of this talk. And live transcription is available on your toolbar as well. And if you're watching us later on YouTube, the links to purchase the books will be in the description for this event. A reminder, you can also shop for more books at literatibookstore.com to have shipped to your home anywhere in the United States. And if you live in Southeast Michigan, our doors are open to the public for in-store shopping. And most of all, we'd like to thank you for your attendance this evening, morning, afternoon, wherever you are in the world. Thank you for being here. Mm-hmm. And now, allow me to introduce tonight's author and our moderator. Ada Limón is the author of The Herding Kind, as well as 5 other collections of poems. These include most recently The Carrying, which won the National Book Critics Circle Award and was named a finalist for the Penn Gene Stein Book Award. And Bright Dead Things, which was named a finalist for the National Book Award, the National Book Critics Circle Award, and the Kingsley Tufts Award. Limón is a recipient of a Guggenheim Fellowship, and her work has appeared in The New Yorker, The New York Times, and American Poetry Review, among others. She is the new host of American Public Media's weekday poetry podcast, The Slowdown. Born and raised in California, she now lives in Lexington, Kentucky. Dawn Lundy Martin is an American poet and essayist. She is the author of 4 books of poems: Good Stock, Strange Blood, winner of the 2019 Kingsley Tufts Award for Poetry; Life in a Box is a Pretty Life, which won the Lambda Literary Award for Lesbian Poetry; Discipline, A Gathering of Matter, A Matter of Gathering; and 3 limited edition chapbooks. Her nonfiction can be found in N+1, The New Yorker, Plowshares, The Believer, and Best American Essays 2019. Martin is the Toy Darracott Endowed Chair of African American Poetry at the University of Pittsburgh and director of the Center for African American Poetry and Poetics. All right, it's all yours.
Thank you. Thank you for those introductions. Dawn, it's so good to see you.
It's so great to see you. Oh my gosh. So how should we begin? Do you want to start by reading some poems?
Sure.
And then, we'll talk about whatever we're going to talk about.
I love that.
Yeah.
Welcome, everyone. It looks like we have a few people here, which is great. I know there's a lot of Zoom fatigue, but it's nice to have the option, I still think, of virtual events for many, many reasons. So I appreciate you joining us. I'm going to start with a poem that's the second poem in the book, called Drowning Creek. And I think I'll just read like 5 poems, and then Dawn and I will chat. And this is a poem called Drowning Creek. Past the strip malls and the power plants, out of the holler, past Gun Bottom Road and Brassfield, and before Redlit Creek, there's a stream called Drowning Creek, where I saw the prettiest bird I'd seen all year. The belted kingfisher, crested in its Aegean blue plumage, perched not on a high snag, but on a transmission wire, eyeing the creek for crayfish, tadpoles, and minnows. We were driving fast toward home, and already our minds were pulled taut like a high black wire latched to a utility pole. I want to stop the car to take a closer look at the solitary, stocky waterbird with its blue crown and its blue chest and its uncommonness. But already we were a blur and miles beyond the flying fisher by the time I had realized what I had witnessed. People were nothing to that bird, hovering over the creek. I was nothing to that bird, which wasn't concerned with history's bloody battles or why this creek was called Drowning Creek, a name I love, though it gives me shivers, because it sounds like an order, a place where one goes to drown. That bird doesn't call the creek that name. That bird doesn't call it anything. I'm almost certain, though I am certain of nothing. There is a solitude in this world I cannot pierce. I would die for it. And then because it's a poem that I feel close to in a lot of ways, this is a poem about Forsythia, which is that beautiful yellow early spring flower. And for us, it's still blooming, but it's usually the first sign of spring. It's a prose poem. Forsythia. At the cabin in Snug Hollow, near McSwain Branch Creek, just spring, all the animals are out, and my beloved and I are lying in bed in a soft silence. We are talking about how we carry so many people with us wherever we go, how even when simply living, these unearned moments are a tribute to the dead. We are both expecting to hear an owl as the night deepens. All afternoon from the porch, we watch as an eastern towhee furiously builds her nest in the untamed Forsythia, with its yellow spilling out into the horizon. I told him that the way I remember the name Forsythia is that when my stepmother, Cynthia, was dying that last week, she said lucidly but mysteriously, more yellow. And I thought, yes, more yellow. And I nodded because I agreed. Of course, more yellow. And so now in my head, when I see that yellow tangle, I say, Forsythia, 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 more yellow. It's night now. The owl never comes. Only more of night and what repeats in the night. I like this, Dawn. It's just like I'm reading to you.
It's true.
It's just like our prose group.
I'm following along.
This is a poem that begins the second section, which is about cypress trees. But of course, it's not about that at all. It begins with the trees. 2 full cypress trees in the clearing, intertwined in a way that almost makes them seem like one, until at a certain angle from the blue blow-up pool I bought this summer to save my life, I see it is not 1 tree, but 2, and they are kissing. They are kissing so tenderly it feels rude to watch. One hand on the other's shoulder, another in the other's branches like hair. When did kissing become so dangerous? Or was it always so? That illicit kiss in the bathroom of the Four-Faced Liar, a bar named after a clock. What was her name? Or the first one with you at the corner of Metropolitan Avenue before you came home with me forever? I watch those green trees now and it feels libidinous. I want them to go on kissing without fear. I want to watch them and not feel so abandoned by hands. Come home. Everything is begging you.
Did you? I made an audience noise. Did you hear?
Oh, yeah, you did. I needed
said,
that. Thank you. I think I'll just read the 2 more. Is that right? Yeah. I like how I said 5 and I still was like, I don't know how many that was already. That was 3. Let's see, where do I want to go here? This, you know what, I haven't read this poem at a reading, and so I would love to do this one. And it's called Hooky. We skipped that last class, rolled joints in my clean apartment close to a bar called Flowers, which we loved and went to so often that once Joel's dad found his maxed out credit card statement and said, "Who are you buying all these flowers for?" That day, We weren't bound for the bar where Foddy kept a back table for friends and on busy nights let us hover. It was a rare Brigadoon day when the sun bared herself in Seattle's U district and the trees were in heat and everything felt wild and illicit, and we decided to get high as we could and lie down under the cherry trees. I was straight A's and Dean's List, but could roll 3 perfect joints and even add a filter thanks to 3 guys I met at a Spanish hostel. And when we made it to the kaleidoscopic row of ancient cherry trees, we started laughing, hard and scary-like, contagious, and the breeze was blowing pink cherry blossoms through the air, and everyone we saw was stoned and making out with someone, and it seemed so absurd that we would ever learn anything from inside the darkness, and soon it wasn't so much funny anymore, but serious. The true and serious beauty of trees, how it seemed insane that they should offer this to us, how unworthy we were, bewildered, how soon we were nearly weeping at their trunks as they tossed down petal after petal, and we tried to remember how it felt to receive and notice the receiving. Pink, 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 pink. And then the last poem I'll read is a poem called, where is it? Called Lover. And thank you all for being here. Lover. Easy light storms in through the window, soft edges of the world smudged by mist. A squirrel's nest rigged high in the maple. I've got a bone to pick with whoever is in charge. All year I've said, you know what's funny? And then nothing. Nothing is funny. Which makes me laugh in an oblivion is coming sort of way. A friend writes the word lover in a note, and I'm strangely excited for the word lover to come back. Come back, lover. Come back to the 5 and dime. I could squeal with the idea of blissful release. Oh, lover, what a word, what a world, this gray waiting. In me, a need to nestle deep into the safekeeping of sky. I am too used to nostalgia now, a sweet escape of age, centuries of pleasure before us and after. Still, right now, a softness like a worn fabric of a nightshirt. And what I do not say is, I trust the world to come back, return like a word, long forgotten and malign for all its gross tenderness, a joke told in a sunbeam, the world walking in, ready to be ravaged, open for business.
Mm. Wow, thank you.
Thank you, Dawn.
So I thought I'm going to ask you some questions and then and we'll see like where and when the conversation emerges, I think. But I did feel compelled to kind of start with a rather serious question, which is related to the fact that like today is a day when a lot of us are reeling emotionally as we face the realities around the recent like mass murders of Black people and Asian American people. And you know, and I just feel like it can't go unavoided in conversation about art. And so I was thinking, you know, often I turn to Toni Morrison when I'm like feeling I don't know how to grapple with my feelings, especially when it comes to something like violence. And she has this quote in an essay called Peril, which I'm not gonna read the whole quote. There's like elliptical moments here, ellipses, but I'm gonna read it and then and see what you think. So she says, I've been told that there are 2 human responses to the perception of chaos, naming and violence. And then she goes on to say, there is a third response to chaos, which I have not heard, which is stillness. Such stillness can be passivity and dumbfoundedness. It can be paralytic fear, but it can also be art. So I wanted to just invite you to talk a little bit about stillness and art in the face of violence and chaos in your own poems, in your own process. I mean, I think especially given the times during which, you know, I assume part of The Hurting Kind was written, right? So during the pandemic and right before the summer of racial uprisings. And yeah.
I love that quote. And I find it, and I'm really glad you brought, you know, what's happening right now into the conversation, because I find it really awkward, even as we talk on Zoom. It's like, oh, there's a reason we're on Zoom, right? There's this, the pandemic is still ongoing and continuing. And I feel like all of these things that we just keep soldiering through, right? This idea that we're just supposed to kind of walk into the fire again and again every single day and be okay. And it's exhausting, and we're not okay. No one I know is okay. You know, I mean, we're surviving, and there still is joy. But there is that sort of, I mean, I don't know about you, but even the word resilience, I find like I get exhausted just thinking about it. Like, oh, do we really have to be resilient? You know, I'm tired of being resilient.
Right. It's an effort. It's like a lot of work to be resilient.
Yeah. And so I feel like there's, you know, there's so many things to be completely sort of surrender to the darkness. And I find that in me, like that is in me. And I think that one of the ways that I try not to surrender, like there's two ways, I guess, is that I do find some peace and ease in the natural world. And it's especially true when I don't feel like I even want to participate in humanity. And I know that sounds dire, but there are times when I feel like, you know, like I just don't want to be part of it. And it is easier for me then to look at nature or to be part of the non-human animals. And that's not to say that non-human animals don't have their, you know, moments of cruelty and survival, but it's a different thing. And I think that the other way I do that, right? So this turning to the nature, but the other way that I do that is to actually think backwards in some ways, to find that moment in which so many people in my life and many of our lives have suffered so much and through so many hard things. And I think, who am I to be the person that gives up? You know? Right. Like, okay, like my grandfather crossed a border and lived in a chicken coop, you know, like, oh, I'm going to give up today, you know? And I feel like sometimes surrendering and lying down on the floor feels like the better thing. And sometimes it's actually a good thing. And sometimes we need to do that. And that's okay for a little while. But then I really do think about what I owe those who have come before me. And it doesn't even have to be a bloodline thing, right? But poetic ancestors, the historical legends of our time that we look up to, people who have worked so hard to make even this moment possible, where you and I can talk about poems. And so I think those two things always bring me back. And I don't know, I know we talked about stillness, and I think those two things offer that a little bit, that they exist in that same place.
Yeah. I love that. And I was actually thinking about your connection to the natural world, to trees, to plants, to animals, when I was thinking about this question, actually, because especially when reading this book, I found like this kind of like kind of a poetics of the micro emerge in
Mm.
order to build toward these like more existential questions that you're asking in the book. And this weird thing had happened to me because the way that I read it is, I don't have your connection in the particulars to the natural world that you have. And so I had to look up a lot of, I was like, oh, what's this? What does this look like? What does this tree look like? What does this bird look like? And what I found actually was like a weird thing. A kind of animation happened in my mind where I started seeing what I usually just see as a kind of beautiful green blur in the particulars.
Yeah.
You know, and I was thinking, oh, what's cool about that is that it kind of creates a new world. Like it takes something that was previously to me, like kind of, you know, abstract and just like, you know, I'm just enjoying. And it created this whole other world, which is also, I think, I don't know, it's just interesting. From the reader's perspective to think about the, you know, the power of that in the face of, you know, unimaginable global loss or, you know, or whatever it is that we're going through as a culture, as the human race in any particular moment.
Yeah. I mean, I think there's so much power in that deep looking, you know, I think that there's like that sort of, I love it because you and I have talked about this in the past, but I think that there is that sort of, you know, that almost moment where you can transform your own surroundings into something that feels almost surreal or magical or mystical in a way that it might be necessary for a second or even a brief moment, when the mind is too heavy, when everything's too heavy. And I think as a kid, I loved those moments in books where someone, you know, walked through a closet and ended up in a different world, or went, you know, did something and suddenly there was magic. And I think that as an adult, whatever that means, I feel like I was like, I think I can do that for myself. I think, and I don't even think it's always poetic. I think it's actually instinctual, like as an act of not escaping the world. Although sometimes that's helpful too. And there's nothing wrong with that occasionally.
Yeah.
But to actually see something good, almost in a way that like makes it technicolor or strange, or like you were saying, like it's a different animation, you know? Yeah, I love that.
This is, I mean, the seeing something good part, I think a lot of readers so far like to talk about the seeing something good, I think, in The Herding Kind. And what I think is really interesting is that maybe it's just because I'm me, but like the way I read, like often I'm, you know, so I read this book twice. Once when I thought that this event was in March.
When I first asked you.
The other day. But both times I kind of came to the same reading, which is that like across these poems, there's a grappling. And it's almost a grappling toward a desire, I think. Well, I think that there's a grappling in part because there's a lot of death in this book.
There's a lot of death.
And like weird shit happens. Like there's like, you know, you and your brother or you and your best friend when you're little, like accidentally kill things, you know? And it's like, so there's a grappling. And there's death, actual death.
Yep.
There's the dead that we carry with us. And it's often, I think what's interesting, so it's going to be like a two-part question, I think. What also interesting is that the dead, when you get to the dead, you name them as dead often. Like you don't tend to use metaphor for death.
Right.
So I feel like there's a conversation between like all the good stuff in life and then like the really bad things and the regret and the things that are out of our control. like, so the first part of this question is like, do you see like, like across these poems, it's not an attempt to reconcile between, like, I think, and you tell me if this is right for you, between like that good stuff and that bad stuff. Like they're always in kind of struggle and conversation and trying to work it out so that we can possibly, like, the struggle to reach some kind of, these really beautiful moments of joy and delight or whatever it is, pleasure, up against, I think, the suffering, which is really present for me in this book.
Yeah, I think that's very true. And I'm actually really glad you brought that up. In fact, I was just talking to someone today who asked me what had been surprising, because the book has only been out for technically 6 days, right?
Yeah.
And she said, what has surprised you with you doing these in-person and virtual events? And I actually said that everyone keeps talking about the sort of the joy in the book.
Right.
And I mean, I love that they are. I love that.
Mm-hmm.
But I find it really interesting. And the book is even called The Hurting Kind. And it's really about what it is to be hurt by the world and what it is to be porous to the world and to be tender to the world and to recognize that deep sensitivity, and actually push against some of those old stories of courage and bravery and resilience and all of those things that are great, but they're also sometimes a false story of like, this is me and I will, overcome everything. And I think that a lot of what I'm working on, at least in my own life, is trying to figure out how to be really truthful about both things. Because I think what happens is that sometimes we sterilize the hurt.
Yeah.
Or we sort of sterilize the joy. Like there's a way in which both of them are too clean when we talk about them with each other, or we try to, and I think the whole book is really against, to summing up, it's against and this is how we do it, right? It's very much a sense of ongoingness, and surrender to that these two things exist and they're not going to stop existing.
Right.
One is not going to win.
Right.
So I think I'm just really happy that we're talking about that, because for me, the book in many ways is my heaviest book. And I think it's really talking about the dead and the dying, and also are oftentimes the way that we move past them very quickly, right? Like someone's gone and then it's just like, okay, right. Someone's gone. And I don't know. I just stopped believing in that a little bit. I think that they're here and they helped me write the book, and I think, but I love what you said about it's not necessarily I figured it out, but this is a reckoning with it. And it's just an ongoingness that it's going to continue.
Yeah. No, I see that really clearly. There's this great quote from Anne Sexton. So I've been reading these, Kristen Dombeck gave me a book for my birthday, and it's all of these, she's a nonfiction writer, and she gave me this book, which is a collection of interviews from the Paris Review of women writers. So I was reading the Anne Sexton interview the other day, and she said this interesting thing, which, so she's just talking about her life. The interviews are so long. For those of you who've never seen these interviews, like they go to the person's house, the writer's house, and they, interview them for a really long time and then transcribe the interview. But this little bit from Anne Sexton, she said, suicide is, after all, the opposite of the poem. And that made me think that maybe like the whole of death might be also the opposite of the poem. She was talking particularly about suicide. And I'm wondering, like, what you think about that, like in terms of like your own approach to poetry and poetics, like what is that, if you agree with that, what does that mean for you in your process, in your writing?
Yeah, I love that. And I remember coming across that quote before and just being really moved by it, because I think very early on in my writing, I was sort of I was a young one, and I had this idea that like I was supposed to do something with my work that affected other people. And it's funny that as I've aged, I'm just like, no, I'm supposed to do something with my work that affects me
Mhm.
and changes me. And then if something else comes from that, that's fabulous, but it's not actually the intention always.
Yeah.
Um, and I thought, oh, what I want is for poetry or my poetry to make people recommit to the world.
Mm.
Because I had lost so many friends in that manner. And then I realized, like, oh no, it's just supposed to help me recommit to the world.
Right.
Like just on a very like basic level, the act of writing is like, okay, here we go. I'm going to do this. And this is the process.
Mhm.
And it's also about like, there's a great quote. I'm trying to remember, Richard Hugo, who
Mm.
wrote, writing as a way of saying you and the world have a chance.
Mm.
And I think about that a lot, right? Like,
Yeah.
yeah, it's like you and the world have a chance. It's not saying like everything's going to be okay.
Mm.
It's saying you have a chance. And so I think it is in some ways the poem being the opposite of death, but also opposite of death in the sense that it's not just the recognition of life,
Mm.
but it's also the recognition and act of resurrecting,
Mhm.
so that memory and bringing someone back to life on the page
Mm.
is an active thing. And
Mm.
that is, I'm really interested in that work.
Mm.
And I feel very close to like, what is it to like bring someone back on the page? Of course they're not, we all know someone is gone, they're gone, right? But
Yeah.
also that sense of like, can you do that work of remembering that on some level does feel
Mhm.
like bringing them whole
You
again.
just reminded me that I forgot to ask you the second part of the other question, which was about metaphor.
Yeah.
Because you said when they're gone, they're gone.
Mm.
And so I'm just curious as like, is there like a real resistance on your part for that reason or for another reason, that to name the dead as dead, like without, kind of maybe figurative speech coming in and interrupting?
Yeah, I love that you noticed that.
Hmm.
I think I do that even in my life. I mean, there are almost always those things where you're like, oh, I do that in my life. I do that in my poems.
Hmm.
But I feel like there's so many euphemisms for death, and there's also, I mean, I understand it because it's really hard, but there's a softness sometimes.
Hmm.
And sometimes I feel like, it's a way of self-protection. It's a way of self-preservation. But at other times, I think it's really doing us a disservice to, again, to use that word, like sterilize or distance us from the process.
Mm.
And I think I'm interested in what it is to recognize that the process of death is real, and that we will go through it, and that people we love will go through it, and that dying can take a very long time sometimes.
Mm-hmm.
And it's not something over here, it's right here.
Right.
It's in me right now. We're born with our death inside of us.
Mm-hmm.
And I think like that idea to me is really part of what makes me want to keep writing, right?
Yeah.
But I think it's also a part of it feels like it's a little bit of a disservice to just think like, oh no, they just go over there, or it's just this sort of easy, soft passing. And you and I have talked about this in the past, and those of you who are listening and who know my work, I when my stepmother passed away, it was a home death. I was by her side the moment she passed. I was by her side the weeks leading up to that and months leading up to that. My father and my little brother were with me, and they were amazing, and we did all the work. And I remember after that experience really struggling with people who were like, oh, she's in a better place, she's gone now.
Oh,
And just
right.
kind of like this sort of this
Yeah.
tidying up of things.
Mhm.
And I think that that shifted me forever, that I was like, no, this is not tidy.
Mhm. Mhm.
There is nothing tidy about this. Like, this is wild. And
Mhm.
I had this moment where I was, and I think you remember, because you and I were together for some of it, where I was like,
Mhm.
how is not everyone talking about this all the time?
Right. Yeah.
And how are we not just weeping in the streets? Just
Mhm.
completely collapsing. Like, it just
Mhm.
feels almost wild that we continue. And it's
Mhm.
also beautiful that we continue, and that people are losing people and experience that and then go and take care of their kids or brush their teeth or,
Mhm.
and I just find it fascinating. And that to me is like that human existence. And I'm fighting against the word resilience, but like exist.
Mhm.
And
Right.
yeah, I think that shifted me forever. And so I think I do sort of, maybe I'm a little all elbows when it comes to
Right.
that sort of this softening the edges,
Mhm.
mortality.
Mhm. I'm thinking about that, and I think we feel the same way really about this, the reality, and then like the kind of dressing up, the kind of concept of death, like the way in which people have to come up with ways to kind of explain it away or use language that explains it away in order to be able to go on. And that's fine.
Totally okay.
It's not necessarily what I want to do.
Mhm.
This might be because we're both Aries. I don't know.
This could be.
um,
It could be
okay.
because we're both poets.
Both poets. Yeah. So, for the writers in the audience, I don't know, there have to be writers in the audience. I want to ask you a kind of craft question.
Okay.
So I heard you once say, I think this is what I heard you once say. I didn't write it down, but I think you said the poem happens in the middle of the poem, something like that. Did you say something like that?
Yeah, that makes sense.
And so I love the poem about your brother, I think Cyrus and the Snakes.
Yeah.
And I love how we're like deep inside of this story about your brother holding a snake as tall as he was, and then another about the two of you cracking open an egg from the chicken coop, and then you found an unhatched chick. And then suddenly we're about a quarter of the way through the poem. No, there's a quarter of the poem probably left. And we get this stunning turn. And this is just part of the sentence, but years later, back from Mexico or South America, he'd admit he was tired of history, of always discovering the ruin by ruining it. And so I just thought it was so surprising. Like, I'm reading the poem, just going on, I'm in the story, and then this happens a lot, right? In your work. And I think this is a part of it. But my question is, this is a part of writing poetry, to kind of like have these turns and kind of in and out of the story to get to some other questions. And so I'm just wondering, like, when you started writing this poem, did you know that you were going there?
No.
And then, so this is for the writers who are in the craft question, like, how did you get there?
You know what? I am actually, the interesting thing for me about the process of writing in general, but I'll just talk this poem in particular, which was that I really wanted to write a poem for him. I'd never written a poem really for my brother, and I wanted to, I think that it's, earlier work and a lot of poems that we have poems that are sort of, there's a hard edge against particular men who have hurt us. And there have been a lot of men who have done that throughout history. And it felt like, I was thinking about what it was about the snakes and him with the snakes. And it was, his gentleness with them. And then also that moment when the unhatched chick we found in the egg, like, he was so sad, and I know he wanted to cry, but I also knew he couldn't. I was allowed to, and then he was not allowed to. And we were alone, but it was still like, that was what we knew. And then, moving onward, it was like, oh, right. Like this, he has always been, and it goes back to the title, like the hurting kind a little bit, right? He is tender in that way and respectful. And like, I remember he was thinking about when they discover, some incredible temple, and then, basically flattening the jungle around it and tearing down all these trees in order to make it this destination, and he was just tired of it. He was tired of all of this sort of mastery over the land, right? And I hadn't realized that was where I was going to end up. But I suddenly saw how they connected. And I don't even know if I saw how they connected until I actually wrote them.
Right. That's what I was going to ask. Yeah. Until you wrote. Yeah. Right. I'm thinking about like all of the different, like all of them, because I can't hold them all in my head, but there's a lot of different gestures in like poetic gestures. And I think, it all feels like Ada Limón, but like there are variations and what I would call like your poetics, like working in this book. Like I feel like the second, I think it's so cool. The second section, I think it's the second section of the poem, the title poem, The Hurting Kind, where the poetics just becomes like really weird and disjunctive, kind of like listy or something. And and I was just like, oh, this is amazing. And then, so I can't name all gestures, but I love that. And then, but I love this poem too, on page 48. So this is the one by the same poet. I mean, not by the same poet, but this is the one where you referencing the same poet in
Alejandra
epigraph. How do you say her name?
Alejandra Pizarnik.
Yes. And I was actually wondering if you could read that poem. Would you mind?
I would love to.
Okay.
I have wanted clarity in light of my lack of light. After Alejandra Pizarnik. Fireworks in the background, like an incongruous soundtrack, either celebratory or ominous, a veil of smoke behind a neighbor's house, the air askew with booms. The silver suitcases dragged down the stairs, a clunk, another clunk, awkward wheels where wheels aren't any use, uselessness of invention. There is a knocking in the blood that is used to absence but hates this part the most. The sudden buried hope of illusion, lose my number sadness, lose my address, my storm door, my skull. Am I stronger or weaker than when the year began? A lie that joins two selves like a hinge. Sawdust in the neighbor's garage that smells of the men who raised me. What is the other world that others live in, unknown to me? The ease of grin and good times. Once I loved fireworks so much they made me weep without warning. I smoked too much pot once young summer and almost missed them until I simply remembered to look up. Gold Valley, crackling and chaos. Now it is a sound that undoes me. Too much violence in the sky. In this way, I have become more dog, more senses, shake, and nerve. Better now when the edges of the night are just bats, erratic and avoiding the fireflies. How much more drama can one body take? I wake up in the morning and relinquish my dreams. I go to bed with my beloved. I am delirious with my tenderness. Once I was brave, but I have grown so weary of danger. I am soundlessness amid the constant sounds of war.
I love that. So Mike, I think there are some questions from the audience, but before we move to those, I just wanted to ask you, because I know this happens to me when I'm like working, kind of reading another writer and kind of working with their text in some way. I always learn something new when it works about like what it is that my own poetic enterprise.
Yeah.
And so I'm just curious, like what happened for you? Did you learn something new about your own poetic enterprise?
Yeah. I think this is one of those poems. I love this question, Dawn, and thank you so much for just being you. You know how much I look up to you and your poems, and so talking about this with you is such an honor. But I feel like one of the things that this poem taught me, that what I was working on, right, is you're like, oh no, this is a project, or this is my life's work, or this is a new book or something. Was that there wasn't an answer and that the poem wasn't going to end on an answer. And that really it was going to be about the many things, the many lives, the many senses, all of the things, and accepting shifts and the shifts that change over and over again. The senses that go this way, to be a little bit more animal self. And that seemed really important, to allow myself that silence. And I think it was a particular time when everyone there was so much noise. And there was so much, like, there was this weird moment in my neighborhood where there was fireworks going on and people were celebrating. And yet at the same time, we were in the pandemic. We were having like this huge racial reckoning that is long overdue. And yet it was like this, it just felt like there was this real energy of violence in the air. And I realized that as a younger person, I would have thrown myself into it. And instead, I felt this sort of older me recognizing what it was to watch that on somewhat, not of a distance level, but as more of an animal self of like, what is this doing to my body? And that fascination with that. And again, without an epiphany, without a conclusion, without a moment of, this all makes sense.
Right. I mean, I know that we are moving on. I just want to say one last thing before we do, which is that I also admire and look up to you. And I think that this is one of the things that we are not going to get to talk in any depth about is just like the structure of this book is like fucking genius. And the way, for example, that you end that, that poem brings us on soundlessness, brings us back up to the epigraph. And in this really complicated way. So thank you for inviting me to chat.
Thank you. I adore you.
So I know I hate to break this up. You all are in such a good group. But we do have several questions from the audience for you, Ada. The first one is from a viewer who's a big fan of your work, especially teaching it to younger women writers. And she wanted to know, how do you see The Hurting Kind as connected to the arcs set up in your previous books, but also interrogating new inner social eco-geographical territories?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think it very much is connected to my earlier work, but I think it does one thing that's different, or at least, maybe it does many things that are different, because I hope I've grown with every book as a writer and as a human. But I think it is doing the work of decentering the self in some ways, so that it's not always necessarily coming back to the I, the capital letter I, but that it's also focusing in on the watching and the witnessing, and then also receiving the world. That it's not always looking back, or not, that it's reciprocal, that it's in a reciprocal relationship with the world. And I think this book is even more so than the other books before it. And I think that's part of the thrust of the whole book, is that sense of ongoingness, and the sense of ongoingness without even the self.
Okay, so next question is kind of two that were submitted sort of interrelated. Wondering if or how your writing process has changed over the course of writing 6 collections, both with regards to where you find the poems in your life, the actual process of putting them on paper, and then someone wanted to know about specifically your process of revision. How long do you work on the same poem? Does it get dozens, just a few? How much time does it take to craft a poem?
Yeah. I mean, it really depends on the poem. I love this question because it is always different for me, and I'm sure Dawn is the same way. But there's a poem, the poem of the book called "The Hurting Kind," and that actually took me 3 years to finish. And I think it was partly because I did not know how to get out of the poem. The poem could have gone on forever, and I still think it just does. And so I had to recognize that the ending had to actually be against an ending. And once I landed that into that world, I could actually figure out how to end the poem. Whereas a poem like Sanctuary, which is much shorter, came out in one sitting. I revised it many times that day. And even by the end of the day, I thought, I think this, it will go through more revision down the road, but it's a complete draft. It feels complete. So it really depends on the poem. And not just the length of the poem, because a long poem can, may take less time sometimes, you don't know. But in this particular case, the longer poem at the core of the book took 3 years.
And then our final question for Ada. In the title poem, you write, "I will not stop this reporting of attachments. There is evidence everywhere." With these poems, as you've expressed, you draw out all the connections you feel appearing strongly. Where do you draw the line at what goes too far, or what is too much of a reach for a given poem to attach to?
Ooh, I love questions about lines. Where do I draw a line? My friend Jennifer L. Knox was always saying, "What line?" And I feel like there is sort of a feeling in me where I'm like, I don't know. I don't know if there is a line. I might be willing to cross over a line to be attached to something or to see something that I'm interested in and that someone may not deem worthy of of a poem or as a poetic subject. I think I'm always interested in what people say. Oh, you couldn't write a poem about that. Like that would be so. And then I'm like, I'm like, oh, I take it as a challenge. So I don't know. I think that there's not. If I thought that I could make myself unattached to things, that would be amazing. But I am, as I age, I've only grown more and more attached to things. So I feel like the line will continue to blur, and I will continue to cross it.
And last minute edition question.
Yeah.
Someone remembers you saying once that you are the speaker of most of your poems. They found it very refreshingly genuine and brave to say this, but they were wondering if you could talk more about that and whether that is still true with The Hurting Kind.
Yeah, it's not true for all poets, but I am the speaker of these poems. I am the person behind them, and the speaker is me. And it's the way that I feel works in my life as an artist. It's not the way that everyone feels, and it may be very uncomfortable for some writers and some artists. For me, I've somehow need to align who I am with what I'm making, and that has always been the case. And so yeah, no, it's I would say it is still me. It is 100% me on the page. And that is not to say it's not craft. And that's not to say it's not artistry. And that's not to say it's not sonic work and, all of the tension and the prosody that goes into making a poem. But in terms of its impulse and its humanity and the biography behind it, that's still me.
I will say before we wrap up, we also got a lot of compliments on your reading of your own poems. People very liked your reading style.
Thank you. Thank you.
And with that, we are reaching the top of the hour. So Ada and Dawn, thank you for joining us on At Home with Literati tonight. And thanks to our viewers as well. Make sure you buy the book. The link is in the chat on the event listing. If you're watching this on YouTube, it's in the description down below. And of course, you can always come into our store and shop. So thank you for your support, and we'll see you at the next event.
Thank
Thank
you.
you, everyone.
Bye,
Thanks for
everyone.
being here.
Bye, Ada. Mwah.
I love you, Dawn.
Love you.